Wyoming Territory, late October, 1888. Eleanor Vance was on her knees, a stranger's fist twisted into her collar. "Please don't look," she begged, her voice barely a breath, eyes locked on the dusty floorboards beneath her. Above her stood three men. Mayor Blackwood, smiling like it cost him nothing. Sheriff McCready, enjoying every second of it, and her own husband's brother, too much of a coward to even meet her eyes. Then the porch boards groaned. A shadow filled the doorway. The cold clack-clack of a rifle's lever action cut through the silence, and in that instant, everything in that room changed. Who was the man standing there? And why did three cruel men suddenly have nothing left to say? Stick around till the end. You won't believe how this story ends. The afternoon light came through the window sideways, the way it always did in late October. Thin, pale, like it was already giving up on the day. Eleanor Vance was at her desk when she heard the horses. She didn't look up right away. She finished the numbers she was writing, 847, 0, Lot 14. Marcus, Washington. Recorded deed, and set the pen down clean. Then she folded her hands on the ledger and waited. 3 sets of boots hit the porch. The door didn't knock. It never did anymore. It came off the frame in a spray of splinters, and Mayor Josiah Blackwood walked through it like he owned the place, which, in his mind, he already did. "Mrs. Vance." He pulled off his glove one finger at a time. "I'll make this simple." Behind him came Sheriff Bull McCready, hat low, thumb hooked in his gun belt, scanning the room with the flat eyes of a man who enjoyed this part of the job. And behind McCready came Thaddeus, her dead husband's brother, staring at a spot somewhere above Eleanor's head. Not at her. He hadn't looked directly at her in 6 months. She stood up from the desk, slowly. She wasn't going to let them have the satisfaction of watching her scramble. "There's nothing here for you, Mayor." Blackwood smiled. He had a politician's smile, wide and warm and completely empty. "Robert left something behind when he died. A ledger, a very specific ledger." He tilted his head. "You know the one. My husband left behind a pile of debts and a leaking roof." "Eleanor." That was Thaddeus. His voice came out thin and apologetic, which was somehow worse than if he'd just stayed quiet. McCready was already moving. He grabbed the bookshelf first, swept everything off it onto the floor. A clay pot shattered. Robert's Bible hit the boards spine first and slid under the bed. McCready watched it happen and moved on, pulling open the cabinet above the stove, dragging out flour, cornmeal, dried beans, dumping them like it was nothing. Eleanor stood very still. This was the thing people didn't understand about her. She had learned, over years of hard living, that stillness was its own kind of armor. Move too fast, and you give them something to chase. Cry, and you give them something to enjoy. Stay still, and make them feel what they're doing. Blackwood watched her watch McCready destroy her kitchen. "Where is it?" "I don't know what you're talking about." He nodded, once like she'd confirmed something. "Bull." McCready crossed the room in 4 steps. He was a big man wide across the chest, hands like sledgehammers. He grabbed Eleanor by the collar of her dress and took her off her feet. She hit the floor on her knees. He was looking for the key. She knew it, the small iron key on a cord she wore around her neck, beneath her clothes. He yanked at the collar, heard the cord. She turned her face toward the floorboards. The dust was thick down there. She could see the grain of the old pine, the dark stain where Robert had spilled lamp oil 3 winters ago. She focused on that stain. She made herself very small inside her own chest, like blowing out a candle. If she could just go somewhere else in her mind, somewhere quiet, some far, then they couldn't have this moment. They could have the room. They could wreck everything Robert ever built. But they couldn't have this. "Please." The word came out before she could stop it. Not loud, barely above a breath. Her voice scraped against the floor. "Please don't look." She wasn't begging for mercy. She understood, in her bones, that mercy was not something McCready carried. She was asking, in the only way left to her, to be allowed the dignity of being invisible, to not have 3 men witness the final stripping away of the last wall she had. McCready found the cord, and then the porch boards groaned. 1 step, then another. slow, unhurried. The sound of someone who had nowhere urgent to be, and knew it. Then the spurs. A clean, rhythmic silver clink with each step. The sound stopped at the doorway. Nobody moved. The light shifted. A shadow filled the frame tall, still backlit by the late sun, so that the face was dark and unreadable. The man had a Winchester rifle held low across his body, almost lazy. But his thumb was already on the hammer. The clack-clack of the lever action was the loudest thing Eleanor had ever heard in that room. The man didn't announce himself. He didn't quote scripture or recite the law. He just looked at Macready on the floor above Eleanor. Looked at him the way you look at a dog that's gotten into something it shouldn't have. Macready let go of her collar. Blackwood cleared his throat. Now, friend, you don't know what you're stepping into. The man's eyes moved to Blackwood. That was all. Just moved. Blackwood stopped talking. It took about 30 seconds. Macready stood up slow, keeping both hands visible. Thaddeus was already edging toward the door. Blackwood straightened his coat, reclaimed what dignity he could, and walked out ahead of his own men. The shadow in the doorway stepped aside to let them pass. No words, no threats. He just watched them go. Eleanor heard the horses leave. She stayed on her knees a moment longer than she needed to, breathing. Then she pressed her palms flat to the floor and stood up. The man on the porch had his back to her. He pulled off his duster heavy, dark canvas, trail-worn, and held it out to one side without turning around. An offering. He wasn't going to look. He was telling her, without a single word, that she was allowed to be a person again. She took the coat, and then, for the first time in a very long time, Eleanor Vance allowed herself to shake. The porch was narrow, 2 boards wide, maybe 3. Elias Thorne stood at the far end of it, his back to the door, watching the dust from Blackwood's horses settle back into the road. He heard her moving inside, the scrape of a chair, the clink of something ceramic. He didn't turn around. He'd learned a long time ago that the worst thing you can do after something like that is rush a person. People needed time to put themselves back together. It wasn't something you could help with. You just had to stand somewhere nearby and not make it worse. He studied the yard instead. Modest setup. Clean, though. The fence posts were old but straight. A kitchen garden, nearly done for the season, still had a few late squash hanging on. Firewood stacked tight against the side of the house, split clean and stacked high. Someone had put real work into this place. Someone who knew what a Wyoming winter cost. Behind him, he heard the distinct double click of a shotgun hammer being pulled back. Both barrels. "I'm not going to shoot you," she said. Her voice was level. Not entirely steady, but working hard at it. "I just want you to know I have this, in case your intentions change." "Fair enough," Elias said. He didn't move. A pause, you can turn around. He turned. She was standing in the doorway, his duster still around her shoulders, a 10-gauge shotgun held at her hip. Her face was a wreck. The left side of her jaw was already darkening, and there was a cut above her eyebrow where her head had caught the floor. She'd used a wet cloth on most of it, but you couldn't wipe away the bruising. What he noticed, though, was her eyes, clear, dry, watching him with the careful attention of a woman who had learned not to give away too much. Too fast, she was taking his measure. He let her do it. "You want water," she said. "It wasn't a question. My horse does." She studied him another second, then stepped off the porch and walked toward the well without another word. He followed. She worked the handle herself and held the bucket while his roan drank. She watched the horse rather than him. Her hands on the bucket were steady. "They'll come back," Elias said. "I know. Tonight, maybe. Tomorrow at the latest. I know that, too." He looked at the shotgun she'd leaned against the well post. "You planning to hold them off with that?" "I'm planning to try." He pulled a piece of dried jerky from his coat pocket and chewed on it, thinking the sun was dropping fast behind the ridge. In another hour it would be cold. How many men does Blackwood keep? Between his ranch hands and Macready's deputies. 15, maybe 20 if he calls in favors. And you have a 10-gauge and a prayer. I have 2 boxes of shells, a loaded Remington under the floorboard. And I know this land better than any man Blackwood employs. She looked at him directly for the first time. Don't underestimate what a woman on her own ground can do. He didn't smile. Exactly. But something shifted in his face. I'm not underestimating you, ma'am. I'm accounting for the odds. She picked up the shotgun and turned back toward the house. The odds have never been in my favor. I've managed. He stood by the well and watched her walk away. He had a job 3 counties south, a bail jumper out of Laramie, worth $60 if brought in breathing. His horse was rested and watered, and the road south was still clear before dark. He should go. He knew that. He thought about the way she'd been on that floor, the way she'd turned her face down, the way she'd kept her voice from breaking while McCready had his hands on her. He thought about Blackwood's smile. He'd seen that smile on 100 men, governors, railroad bosses, Pinkerton supervisors sitting behind oak desks in St. Louis, men who knew the law by name because they'd written it to fit themselves, men who had never once in their lives faced a consequence. He pulled his horse from the trough and tied her to the porch post. Then he went inside. She had the medical kit open on the table, small tin box, battered at the corners. She was trying to thread a needle by lamplight, holding it up close to one eye, her jaw set. He sat down across from her without asking. She glanced up. I'm not asking for your help, she said. I know. I'm not going to. Also noted. He folded his hands on the table. I'm just sitting here. She got the thread through and started closing the cut above her brow. No mirror. She was doing it by touch. Quick, precise stitches. Her teeth clenched against the pull of the needle. He watched her and said nothing. He knew better than to offer. She didn't want help. She wanted to be seen doing it herself, which is a different thing. Entirely and a more important one. When she was done, she tied it off and snipped the thread with a small pair of scissors. She pressed a clean cloth to it, looked at him. My name is Eleanor Vance. Elias Thorne. You're a bounty hunter. At the moment. What were you before that? A beat, Pinkerton man. 8 years. Her expression didn't change, but something came into her eyes. Not warmth, more like a calculation being updated. Pinkerton. She said it the way you'd say a word you'd tasted before and didn't much like. I've seen what Pinkerton men do to strikers, to immigrants, to anyone who stands between a rich man and his money. So have I, Elias said. That's why I left. She looked at him a long time. Then she got up, moved to the cast-iron stove, and started a fire. She had cornmeal on the shelf. McCready had missed it. Shoved behind a coffee tin, and she worked without speaking, making a basic cornbread in a pan. He didn't help. He didn't offer. He just sat there like a piece of furniture, which seemed to be exactly what she needed from him right now. After a while, she set the pan on the stove, turned, and leaned against the wall. You're still here, she said. I am. Why? He thought about the honest answer and decided she deserved it. Because I've been riding away from things my whole adult life, and I'm tired. She studied him. The lamp threw shadows across her face, made her look older and younger at the same time. That's not an answer. No, he agreed, but it's the truth. The cornbread began to smell like something. Outside, the wind picked up and pushed against the cabin walls, and Eleanor Vance stood in her lamplight kitchen and decided, apparently, to let him stay. She didn't say so. She just pulled a second tin plate from the shelf and set it on the table. That was enough. He slept in the barn. His choice, not hers. She'd offered the floor. But a man who'd spent half his life on the trail knew the difference between sleeping where you were invited and sleeping where you ought to be. The barn was warm enough. His bedroll was good, and the roan was decent company. He lay awake for a while. He kept thinking about Blackwood's men, the way McCready had moved, practiced, casual cruelty. The kind of man who did this regularly, who had done it to others before Eleanor Vance and would do it to others after. He thought about the bail jumper in Laramie. $60. He thought about Eleanor stitching her own face, closed in lamplight. He wasn't a hero. He'd burned that notion out of himself years ago, somewhere between breaking a miners' strike in Pennsylvania and escorting a railroad man's private car through land that used to belong to Cheyenne families. Heroes were a story. You told people to keep them looking in the wrong direction. The real world ran on money and guns and whoever controlled the deed to the land. He knew that. He believed it. He stared at the barn ceiling and tried to keep believing it until sleep finally took him. Morning came in cold and bright. He was up before her, had coffee going on the small camp stove in the barn, when Eleanor appeared in the doorway, pulling her coat closed. She looked at the coffee. She looked at him. "You're still here," she said again. "I made coffee." She accepted a tin cup without further comment. They stood in the barn door and drank while the sun came over the ridge. Frost on the ground. The squash in the kitchen garden were going to freeze tonight if nobody brought them in. He thought about mentioning it, but figured she'd already done that math. After a while, she said, "I want to show you something." He followed her back to the house. She moved a flat stone near the fireplace, lifted a short board, and pulled out a ledger, standard size. Green cloth cover, worn at the corners. She set it on the table and opened it to the first page. "My husband Robert spent 4 years building this," she said. "He was a bookkeeper before he came west. He knew how land records worked, how titles transferred, what the law actually said versus what Blackwood told people it said." Elias sat down and started reading. The ledger was meticulous, column after column in small, careful handwriting. Dates, names, original deed amounts, amounts paid to Blackwood's land office, amounts re-recorded after the fact. The pattern was clear once you knew what you were looking at. Blackwood was using minor technical violations of the Homestead Act to invalidate claims and refile them under shell company names he controlled. He'd been doing it for years. 12 families, maybe more. Robert was going to take it to the circuit judge in Cheyenne, Eleanor said. She stood across the table, watching him read. "He died before he could. The marshal here answers to Blackwood. The judge here answers to Blackwood. Everyone in 100 miles answers to Blackwood. Except you. Except me." Elias turned pages. He found Marcus Washington's entry, 20 acres, filed 1,874. Improvements documented, taxes paid. Then a second entry 2 years later, the same plot. Refiled under a company called Territorial Land Associates. No record of any legal challenge. No record of Washington being notified. Just gone, on paper, while the man still lived and farmed there. He sat back. "This ledger reaches as far as the governor's office," he said. "There are names in here that have real power. Yes, you understand what that means. Paper doesn't stop bullets. Ma'am, this system is rigged from the dirt to the Capitol. You take this to a circuit judge. Blackwood will know before the judge finishes reading the first page. I know that. Then what's your plan?" "My plan," she said quietly, "is to find one person in this territory who still gives a damn about what's right, and show them what's in that book." She looked at him steadily. "I was hoping that might be you." He closed the ledger. He looked at the table for a long time, at the worn cloth cover, the years of careful work inside it, the weight of 12 families pressed into those pages. Then he stood up, put on his hat, and walked out the door. His horse was saddled in 10 minutes. Eleanor stood on the porch. She didn't call after him. She didn't argue. She had her arms crossed and her chin up, and she watched him mount with the expression of a woman who had expected this and made her peace with it. He pointed his horse south and rode. He made it to the bottom of the hill. He sat there at the base of the slope, the road to Laramie going one way, the ridge going back the other. He could still see the roofline of her cabin from here, a thin line of chimney smoke going straight up in the cold, still air. 12 families. He thought about the ledger, not the evidence in it, the work. 4 years of a man's careful, stubborn belief that truth put down on paper was worth something, that records mattered, that if you documented the theft precisely enough, clearly enough, someone would eventually have to answer for it. Robert Vance had died believing that. Eleanor Vance was still living it. Elias turned his horse around. He rode back up the hill at a trot, came into the yard, and stopped in front of the porch. Eleanor was still standing there. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, not surprised, not relieved, just watchful. "I'm not promising anything," he said. "I'm not asking for promises. I need to know everything about Blackwood's operation, who he uses, where he keeps records, who he's bought, and who he's just scared. I can tell you all of that, And the ledger stays hidden until we're ready to move. Agreed. He dismounted and tied his horse. He stood at the foot of her porch steps and looked up at her. The morning sun was full on her face now, and he could see the bruising from yesterday. Clearly, jaw, cheekbone, the stitched cut above her brow. She wore all of it without apology. One more thing, he said, Marcus Washington. Blackwood's men are going to move on his farm. Eleanor's expression went sharp. When? Based on what's in the ledger. His claim is next in sequence. If Blackwood moves when he usually does, we've got maybe 2 days. She was already reaching for her coat. Then we ride today, she said. They rode north by northwest, following a creek bed that cut through the lower hills. Elias took the lead, but kept the pace to what Eleanor's horse could hold over distance. She rode well, not showy, not hesitant. She knew her horse, and her horse knew the land, and they moved like one thing together. He noticed things like that, old habit from the Pinkerton years. You read people by how they moved, how they held themselves when they thought nobody was watching. Eleanor Vance, on horseback, heading toward trouble, sat straight and rode quiet and kept her eyes on the terrain ahead. No wasted motion, no performance. He'd known a lot of people who fell apart the day after something bad. The body caught up to them. The fear got loud. The decision-making went sideways. Eleanor seemed to be running the opposite direction. Like yesterday, had stripped something unnecessary away and left only the essential. He respected that more than he would have known how to say. They stopped at midday at a wide, flat rock above the creek to water the horses and eat. She'd packed hard biscuits and dried venison wrapped in cloth. She handed him half without comment. He ate and looked out at the valley below. Big country, beautiful in the way of things that could kill you, the sky too wide. The distances too far, the winter already visible in the color of the light. Tell me about Blackwood, he said. She chewed, thought, organized it in her head, the way a bookkeeper would. He could almost see her doing it. He came here in 1869, she said, after the railroad pushed through. He had money from somewhere back east. Nobody's ever been entirely sure where, and he bought the first town lots when Red Rock was nothing but a supply camp, built the bank, built the hotel, got himself elected mayor in 1871. Elections out here aren't complicated, Elias said. No, if you own the bank and you're the only employer for 40 miles, people vote for you or they lose their credit line. She pulled her coat collar up. He's smart. He doesn't steal, obviously. He uses the law. The Homestead Act requires a man to file his claim correctly, improve the land within a certain time, pay the fees on schedule. Most of these families immigrants. Freedmen. The poor, they don't read English well enough to catch the fine print. Blackwood's land agent finds the errors, files a challenge. By the time the family understands what's happening, the title's already transferred, and he's got the local judge, Judge Harlan Pruitt, appointed 3 years ago, right after the previous judge started asking questions about the transfer records. She paused. The previous judge had an accident. Elias looked at her. What kind? Fell down the stairs of the courthouse. Her voice was flat, both legs broken. Moved his family to Denver the following spring. He nodded slowly. He'd seen this pattern before. Not out here, but in the industrial cities back east, where the mechanisms were different. But the logic was the same. Capital consolidates. Power protects itself. The law becomes a tool of whoever can afford to file the paperwork first. The ledger, he said. How complete is it? Robert was meticulous. Every transaction Blackwood ran through the land office, Robert had a copy of. He had a contact inside a clerk named Dewhurst, who had a conscience and was too scared to act, but wasn't too scared to pass paper. She paused. Dewhurst left town 8 months ago, right after Robert died. Convenient. Everything around Blackwood is convenient. She took a drink from her canteen. The ledger documents 12 fraudulent transfers, going back to 1872. It includes 3 transfers that were signed by the territorial governor's land commissioner. That's why it reaches the capital. That's why Blackwood can't let it surface. Elias thought about that. The governor's land commissioner. That was not a small name. That was not a problem you solved by riding to Cheyenne and knocking on a door. You need a federal judge, he said, not territorial. Federal someone the governor can't reach. I know. The nearest federal circuit court with jurisdiction out here is in Cheyenne, but you need the right judge. There are two on rotation: Harlan Voss, who's been known to rule in favor of railroads and large landholders, and Samuel Briggs, who spent 12 years as a public advocate in Ohio before his appointment. She looked at him. You know, the federal bench. I've delivered enough prisoners to courthouses to know who's who. He finished his biscuit. Briggs is your man, but he only sits the Wyoming circuit every third month. He was there in September, so he's back in December, she said immediately. Last week of November, first 2 weeks of December. If we can get the ledger to him directly, before Blackwood gets word, before anyone in the territorial office can intercept 6 weeks, she said. We have to keep the ledger safe and keep ourselves alive for 6 weeks, and keep Marcus Washington's farm out of Blackwood's hands. In the meantime, he stood up and brushed crumbs off his coat, which means we ride. She was already on her feet. Marcus Washington's farm sat in a shallow bowl between two long ridges, protected from the north wind. Good water from a spring-fed pond at the lower end. 40 acres, well tended. You could see the care from the road-straight fence lines. A proper barn with a new roof. A kitchen garden, twice the size of Eleanor's. 3 years of hard work made visible in every post and plank. A man named August greeted them at the gate. He was Marcus's eldest son, 19 or 20, tall and watchful. He studied Elias with the careful stillness of a young man who'd learned that a white stranger on horseback could mean any number of things, most of them bad. Eleanor dismounted and held out her hand to August. Who shook it? Is your father here? In the barn, August looked at Elias again. He's with me, Eleanor said simply. He's trustworthy. My word on it. Something shifted in August's posture. Not fully relaxed, but a degree less guarded. He'd taken her word before. Apparently, he led them to the barn. Marcus Washington was mending a harness. He was a compact, broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s, with hands that showed every year of hard labor and eyes that showed the years before that, years that had taught him to assess a room before speaking. He looked at Eleanor and nodded. He looked at Elias and waited. Eleanor made the introduction. Brief, direct. Elias Thorne. He's agreed to help us get the ledger to a federal judge before Blackwood moves on the rest of the claims. Marcus looked at Elias. Pinkerton. Eleanor paused. Elias noted she'd told him before they arrived, or Marcus had his own sources. Either way, the information was already on the table. Former, Elias said. Left 8 years ago. Why? The question was direct. Marcus Washington was not a man who wasted words, and Elias found himself respecting that more than he'd expected to, because I watched a Pinkerton crew beat a 60-year-old Welsh miner half to death for standing in front of a company gate, Elias said. And when I filed a report objecting to the use of force, my supervisor told me the miner had provoked the situation by existing in the wrong place. I turned in my badge the next morning. Marcus looked at him for a long moment. Then he went back to the harness. What do you need from me? We came to warn you, Eleanor said, based on the sequence in the ledger. Your claim is the next Blackwood will challenge. We think you have a day, maybe 2. Marcus's hand slowed on the harness, but didn't stop. I know, he said quietly. His land agent rode through 3 days ago. Took notes, didn't talk to anyone, just looked. They'll send McCready, Elias said, probably with papers. There'll be a legal challenge claim, some kind of technical deficiency. My filing is clean, Marcus said. There was steel in his voice, not anger, certainty. I had Eleanor's husband review it twice before Robert died. I paid every fee on schedule. I have every receipt. It doesn't matter, Elias said. And then, because this man deserved the plain truth. I know that's wrong. It is wrong. But Blackwood has a judge and a sheriff and a land office. A clean filing just means he has to be more creative about the challenge. Having receipts won't stop McCready from showing up with a writ and 20 armed men. Marcus set the harness down. He looked at Eleanor. Something passed between them The quiet communication of two people who'd had versions of this conversation before, in private, when the day's work was done and the fear had nowhere to go. "What do we do?" Marcus said. "We document everything again," Eleanor said. "Every receipt, every record. I make copies tonight. We get one set to Elias's saddlebag, one set hidden here, one set with your sister in Laramie. And we don't let Blackwood serve those papers without a fight," Elias added. "Not a shooting fight, a legal one. You file a preemptive complaint with the Federal Land Office in Cheyenne tomorrow morning. I'll write the filing. It creates a federal record that exists before Blackwood's writ does." Marcus looked at him. "You know how to do that." 8 years with the Pinkertons meant 8 years watching lawyers work. Some of it was useful. A pause. Then Marcus Washington allowed himself something close to a dry smile. "All right," he said. "Come inside. My wife will feed you." Naomi Washington was a small woman who ran a large household with the organized authority of a general. She had 3 children, besides August's 2 girls of 12 and 8, and a boy of 6 named Samuel, who immediately attached himself to Elias's boot heel and asked 11 questions about the Winchester rifle before Naomi caught him and redirected him toward the supper table. The cabin was warm. The food was plain and good salt pork, beans, cornbread, a preserved peach cobbler that was the best thing Elias had tasted in 3 months. He sat at the far end of the table and watched the family, how they talked over each other comfortably, how Naomi put food in front of the children before sitting herself, how Marcus listened to everything, even when he wasn't speaking, how August monitored the yard through the window in the automatic way of a young man who'd learned vigilance early. This family worked. In the deep, genuine sense, they had taken a piece of raw land and made something real from it. They had built something that mattered. The idea of Blackwood's man arriving with a fraudulent writ to take it settled in his gut like a coal. Eleanor, sitting across from him, was talking to the older daughter, Ruth, 12, quick-eyed and interested in everything. The girl had asked about the ledgers, about bookkeeping, about what numbers meant when they were put into official records. "Numbers in an official record are promises," Eleanor told her. "They say, this happened, this is true. Someone is accountable for this." The powerful try to change the numbers because they know that records are the one thing that outlasts them. Ruth absorbed this with the focused attention of a child who understood she was being told something real. "So if you write things down correctly," Ruth said slowly, "they can't just lie and take it away." Eleanor glanced at Elias across the table, a brief, complicated look. "They can try," Eleanor said. "They try all the time. But correct records, in the right hands, in the right court. With the right judge, those records fight back." She put her hand over Ruth's briefly. "That's worth understanding. That's worth spending your life learning." Ruth nodded seriously. "Then I want to learn bookkeeping." "I'll teach you," Eleanor said, and she meant it. Elias could hear that plainly. Not a polite offer, a real one. He looked down at his plate. He'd met a lot of people across a lot of territories. People who talked about equality and justice in speeches and public meetings, and never once changed how they actually behaved when they were sitting across a table from someone the world told them was worth less. The gap between what people said and how they lived was, in his experience, about as wide as Wyoming. Eleanor Vance had no gap. She treated the Washingtons with the same matter-of-fact respect she gave herself. She didn't make a show of it. She didn't perform any virtue. She just behaved as though the worth of a person was obvious and settled, and not something requiring comment. He thought that might be the most radical thing he'd seen in years. After supper, he and Eleanor sat at the Washingtons' table for 2 more hours, drafting the Federal Land Office complaint in careful legal language that Elias pulled from memory and Eleanor refined for clarity. Marcus reviewed every line. August copied it in a clear hand. Outside, the first stars were out. The night was getting serious cold. When they were done, Elias looked over the finished document. It was good. Better than good. It laid out every procedural element, cited the correct federal statute, and established Marcus Washington's prior rights in language that would require Blackwood's people to spend real legal capital to overturn. It was not a guarantee. He said so. I know, Marcus said. Blackwood has money and time. He can stall a federal challenge for months. I know. This buys you protection, not certainty. Marcus looked at him. Mr. Thorne, I've been dealing in things that aren't certain my entire life. I took a chance on this land. I take a chance every morning I work it. I take a chance every time I ride into Red Rock to buy supplies. He folded the complaint carefully and slid it into an oilskin envelope. I'm not looking for certainty. I'm looking for a fair fight. Give me a fair fight and I'll handle the rest. Elias had nothing to add to that. He nodded once, and that was that. They stayed the night. Eleanor took the Washingtons' spare room, which Ruth and her younger sister, Clara, gave up without being asked, dragging their quilts to the main room floor with the cheerful adaptability of children who regarded it as an adventure. Elias took the barn, same as the night before. Same ritual of spreading his bedroll in the hay, checking his rifle, lying on his back and staring up at the dark. He slept better than he had in months. He wasn't going to think too hard about why. He was up at first light. Cold had come in hard overnight frost on every surface. The water bucket in the barn frozen at the edges. He broke the ice and drank and stood in the barn doorway, watching the sky go from black to that particular cold blue that meant a clear winter day. The first smell of smoke reached him about 30 minutes later. It was wrong, too heavy, too close. The Washington cabin was 50 yards to his left. Chimney smoke going up straight. That wasn't it. This was coming from the other direction. He was running before the thought finished. The barn. Not the sleeping barn, the working barn. The larger one. At the far end of the property, by the equipment yard. By the time Elias hit the fence rail, one whole side of it was fully lit. Flames moving fast through old dry timber. Climbing the walls with the roaring momentum of a fire that had been set, not started. He could smell the coal oil from 20 feet away. Fire. He was already at the barn door, wrenching at the latch. Fire, get the animals out. Marcus came out of the house at a dead run. August was right behind him. Naomi appeared on the porch with the children and pointed them toward the road. Eleanor came from the side of the house, coat not yet buttoned, face sharp and awake. The two horses in the burning barn were screaming. Elias got the latch open, and the door swung wide. A wall of heat pushed back at him. Through the smoke, he could see the horses tied to their posts, eyes wild, legs working. He pulled his bandana up over his face and went in. It was 30 seconds, maybe less. He got the first horse's tie loose, pushed her toward the door. She didn't need a second invitation. He got the second one, a big sorrel gelding who was very close to panic by pulling the knot down and getting his shoulder against the animal's neck, walking him fast and steady toward the open door the way you walked a scared horse. Slow, pressure, keep moving, don't look back. He got them both out. He came out of the barn with his coat on fire at the collar. He stripped it off and threw it. His shoulder was burned, not serious, but it stung sharply through the adrenaline. Marcus and August were already at the well. Bucket brigade moving. Eleanor had the shovels. She was throwing dirt at the base of the fire on the windward side, not trying to stop the barn. That was already gone. But trying to stop the spread toward the fence and the equipment. The fence caught anyway. A line of it, 30 feet, going orange in the dry post tops. Nobody talked. They just worked. It took an hour. The barn was a total loss. Nothing left but the stone foundation and the black spars of the main beams standing like charred ribs against the morning sky. But the fence was out. The equipment yard had held. The cabin, the house, the animals all safe. They stood in the yard in the cold, breathing smoke, covered in soot and sweat. The Washington children had come back from the road when the fire stopped growing. Samuel, the 6-year-old, was pressed against his mother's side, very quiet. Marcus stood at the edge of the ruin and looked at it. He put his hands in his pockets, and he stood there for a long time without speaking. Elias watched him. He knew the math Marcus was running. A barn like that, lumber tools. A winter's worth of hay. The tack that was years of savings and work. Replacing it before the real cold set in was somewhere between very difficult and impossible. Without proper shelter for livestock in a Wyoming winter, you didn't just lose a barn, you lost everything that was in it, which was exactly what Blackwood had intended. Elias had seen this before, too. It wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes dispossession was just a fire in the night and a family doing math in the cold morning and realizing they couldn't outlast what had been done to them. "How many horses do they have?" August said quietly, from beside him, not really asking, just doing the count. "We got yours out," Elias said. "But the feed." August was 18 or 19, but he looked older right now. "We had 2 months of hay in there. And the winter tack. The harnesses, one thing at a time," Elias said. Eleanor had come to stand near Marcus. She didn't touch him or speak at first. She just stood beside him, looking at the same ruin, giving the moment what it was. Then she said, very quietly, "I'm sorry." "Marcus," he nodded once. "This was McCready's work," she said. "Probably 2 men, maybe 3, in and out before dawn. I know whose work it is." His voice was even, not broken, just worn. "We're not going to let this stand. I know that too." He turned from the ruin and looked at her, but knowing it doesn't rebuild a barn. "No," she said, "it doesn't." She looked around the yard at the children, at Naomi at August, doing silent grief math at the fence line. "What do you need most, right now, today?" Marcus thought about it practically. "The way you thought about things, when emotion was a luxury you couldn't afford. The horses need shelter before tonight, or we'll lose them. I can rig something with the poles from the equipment yard, maybe a canvas, but I need help building it fast." "Then that's what we do," Eleanor said, and she turned and walked to the equipment yard without any further discussion. Elias followed. They built a lean-to in 4 hours. Rough work posts from the equipment yard. The heavy canvas wagon cover Marcus kept in the tool shed. Rope and pegs. It wasn't a barn. It wasn't close. But it would cut the wind and hold body heat. And with the horses close packed and a small stove positioned at the opening, it would keep the animals alive through a Wyoming night. The whole Washington family worked. Even Clara, who was 8, carried rope and held posts when told to. Naomi brought food out at midday, and nobody stopped. They ate standing. One hand for the food, and one for whatever task was in front of them. Eleanor Vance worked the way she did everything else, efficiently, without complaint, without stopping. She didn't know everything about barn construction, but she figured things out quickly and asked good questions when she didn't know. She drove posts. She ran rope when the canvas needed stretching, and it took 4 people on 4 corners. She was one of the 4. By late afternoon, the lean-to was done. They stood back and looked at it. It was ugly and temporary, and it was standing, Clara said, with the absolute honesty of an 8-year-old. "It looks like a sad hat." Naomi put a hand over her mouth. August laughed despite himself. Even Marcus's mouth moved. "It'll keep them warm," Ruth said seriously. "That's what matters." "That's right," Eleanor agreed. She looked at Ruth with genuine warmth. "The thing that does its job doesn't need to be beautiful." They brought the horses in. The animals settled immediately, grateful for the enclosure, already less nervous. Elias put down fresh straw from the last bale that had been stored in the tool shed. He moved quietly, and the horses accepted him. He was good with horses. They didn't lie. Supper that night was larger than the night before. 2 neighboring families had appeared in the late afternoon, a German immigrant named Brower, whose farm was 3 miles north, and a widow named Pettigrew, who raised sheep on the east side of the ridge. They'd seen the smoke and come to help and stayed to eat. Naomi stretched the meal to fit everyone, the way people out here did. The way they understood was part of the contract of living this close to the edge. The table was crowded and loud, and the conversation moved across 3 languages. Brower's English was good, but he lapsed into German when he was animated, and nobody minded. His wife translated for the children. Elias sat at the corner of the table and watched all of it. At one point, Ruth, who had appointed herself Eleanor's shadow for the day, asked Eleanor directly about why Mr. Blackwood was allowed to take people's land if it was against the law. Eleanor thought about how to answer. She set down her fork. She gave the question the real attention it deserved. The law is only as strong as the people willing to enforce it, she said. And when the people who are supposed to enforce it are the same people doing the wrong, the law stops working. That's not the law's fault. It's a failure of the people. Then what do? Ruth asked. You document. You record. You tell the truth as precisely as you can, and you put it where it can't be ignored. You find people of conscience, and you show them what you've found. And then she looked at the table, at the crowded, varied faces of the people. Blackwood had been quietly dispossessing for years. You remember that none of us are alone in this. The most powerful thing Blackwood does is make each family feel like they're the only one fighting. He does it on purpose. Isolated people are easier to defeat. The table had gone quiet. You're not isolated, she said. None of you are. You're here. Your neighbors are here. The same wrong has been done to all of you, and that makes you something together. That you aren't alone. Brower said something in German. His wife translated. He says that is how they burned his village in Bavaria. One family at a time. He says you are correct. Eleanor looked at him. I'm sorry about your village, Mr. Brower. He nodded heavily. I built again, he said in English. I will build again here also. Elias looked down at the table. He was not a man who was moved easily. He'd cauterized that part of himself years ago, out of professional necessity. Or that was what he'd told himself. But sitting in this kitchen, at this table, watching Eleanor Vance say plainly what she believed while the fire popped and the children listened and the neighbors nodded and Marcus Washington's face slowly, carefully, recovered some of its composure, he was moved. Not dramatically, not in any way he would have admitted out loud, but something in his chest adjusted, like a compass needle that had been stuck for years and had finally, quietly, swung back toward true north. He looked across the table and found Eleanor looking at him, brief, steady, no performance in it. He looked away first. After supper, after the neighbors had ridden home and the children were put to bed, and Marcus and August were doing the last check on the horses, Elias stood on the porch in the cold with his coffee. Eleanor came out a few minutes later. She stood beside him, not too close. The stars were exceptional tonight, the air clear and dry, the sky enormous. They stood in silence for a while. Macready will escalate, Elias said. The fire was a warning. Next time he'll bring the writ. And if the writ doesn't move Marcus, he'll bring the men. I know. We need to move on getting the ledger to Cheyenne before Blackwood realizes what we're doing. How long do we have? Not long. He knows I'm here now. He knows I'm not just passing through. He looked at the darkness beyond the fence line. He'll want to know who I am, what I'm doing. That takes a day or two. After that, he'll move. Eleanor was quiet, thinking through the sequence. We leave in the morning, she said before dawn. Before dawn, she agreed. The cold settled around them, the kind of cold that was almost peaceful, clear and still and absolute. Somewhere out in the dark, one of the horses shifted in the lean-to. A night bird called once from the ridge and went quiet. What you said tonight, Elias said, about records being worth something, about isolated people being easier to defeat. She waited. You believe that? I do. Even now, after what they did today. She turned to look at him. He could see her face in the starlight, serious, unhurried, without a trace of the false reassurance people usually reached for when things were this bad. Especially now, she said. Bad things are easy to do to people who believe they're alone. Today, those families sat at the same table. They saw each other's faces. They know now they're not the only ones. She paused. Blackwood can burn a barn. He cannot burn that. Elias looked at her. He didn't say anything. He didn't have anything that would improve on what she'd just said. He finished his coffee. He set the tin cup on the porch rail. Before dawn, he said. Before dawn, she said. He went back to the barn. He lay in his bedroll in the dark, listening to the horses breathe in their temporary shelter. And he thought about Eleanor Vance standing in the cold, saying he cannot burn that with the absolute certainty of a woman who had chosen, a long time ago, what she was going to believe in and had not wavered since. He thought about the ledger, hidden in his saddlebag. He thought about 6 weeks. He closed his eyes, and this time sleep came quickly, and it was a long time before anything troubled it. They left before the sky had any color in it. Elias had the horses ready by 4 in the morning. Eleanor came out of the cabin in the dark, her saddlebag already packed, the ledger wrapped in oilskin and tucked against her body under her coat. She didn't say good morning. She mounted and looked at him, and he nodded, and they rode. Marcus stood at the gate to see them off. He had a lantern held low. He looked at Eleanor and said, "You come back, I will," she said. He looked at Elias. "You bring her back." "I'll do my best," Elias said. Marcus lifted the lantern once, then lowered it. They rode into the dark. The plan was straightforward, which meant it had about a dozen ways to go wrong. They would ride southeast toward Cheyenne, taking the long way around through the high country rather than the main road. The main road was faster, but it was also the road Blackwood's men would watch. The high route added 2 days to the journey, but kept them off the obvious path. The ledger needed to reach Judge Samuel Briggs before Blackwood knew they were moving. Every hour of lead time mattered. They rode hard the first day and put 30 miles behind them before they stopped. Elias picked the camp a shallow draw, with good sight lines in 3 directions and a natural windbreak at the back. He'd been picking camps like this for 20 years. It was automatic. Eleanor built the fire low and small. She knew how to do that too, he noticed. Keep it just big enough for warmth and coffee. Not big enough to throw light you could see from the ridge. She hadn't been told. She'd just done it. They ate cold biscuits and beans from the tin Eleanor had packed. The night was clear and brutal cold. "Tell me about the federal filing we sent for Marcus," Eleanor said. She was poking at the fire with a stick, not looking at him, honestly. "Does it protect him?" "It creates a federal record that predates any writ Blackwood files at the territorial level," Elias said. "Legally. That means any challenge to Marcus's claim has to clear a federal hurdle before a territorial judge can act on it. That buys time. But Blackwood has friends at the federal level too. Some the land commissioner, as the ledger shows. But not the circuit bench. Federal judges have lifetime appointments. They don't answer to governors or mayors. Briggs especially, he's got a reputation for independence that's made him unpopular with a lot of powerful people, which is usually a good sign. She thought about that. So the filing and the ledger together. Together, they're a case, Elias said. Separately, either one is just paper. Together, the filing establishes Marcus's legal standing, and the ledger proves systematic fraud. That's the combination you need. Robert understood that, she said quietly. That's why he built the ledger the way he did. He wasn't just documenting individual thefts. He was building a pattern. 12 families. Same mechanism. Same office. Same signatures. Pattern fraud is harder to dismiss than individual disputes. Your husband was smart. He was. She fed another small stick to the fire. He was also afraid. He knew what he was building, and he knew what it would cost if Blackwood found out. He made me promise that if anything happened to him, I'd get it to the right person, and you've been waiting for that person. She looked up at him across the fire. I've been waiting for someone who understood what it was worth and wouldn't run. He held her look. I ran. You came back. The first time a man runs doesn't tell you much, she said. The fact that he came back tells you everything. He didn't have an answer for that. He looked at the fire. The coals had gone from orange to red in the cold air. Somewhere on the ridge above them, a coyote called, long and lonely, and got no answer. Get some sleep, he said. Long day tomorrow. She was already rolling out her bedroll on the far side of the fire. You too, she said. Not a suggestion. An instruction. He almost smiled. The second day was harder. The high route climbed into broken terrain, rocky switchbacks, narrow ledges above creek beds, the kind of riding that was slow and attentive and wore you down by early afternoon. The horses were good, but they weren't mountain horses, and Elias kept the pace careful. He also kept watching the back trail. He couldn't say exactly when he started feeling it, that particular prickle at the back of the neck that came from 20 years of moving through dangerous country. Nothing you could point to. No sound, no movement. just the weight of being observed. He didn't say anything to Eleanor yet. No point in raising alarm before he was certain. But he started checking the ridgelines more frequently, looking for dust, looking for the glint of metal. By midday, they were deep in the pass that locals called Bitter Creek, a narrow slot canyon, 200 yards long, rocky walls rising 30 feet on either side. It was the most direct route through the high country. It was also, he realized as they entered it, the worst possible place to be if someone had gotten ahead of them. He felt it clearly now. Eleanor, he said. His voice was quiet and flat. She'd been riding behind him. She came up alongside. I know, she said. She'd felt it too. He could see it in the way she'd gone still on her horse. How many? Don't know yet. He scanned the rim of the canyon. Rocks, brush, shadow, and light. Nothing moving. Ride close behind me. If I say run, you ride. You don't look back. Elias, the ledger has to get through, he said. That's the job. If something happens to me, you ride and you don't stop. She held his eyes for 1 second. Then she nodded. They moved forward into the canyon. The first shot came from the left rim, 20 feet up. Elias had his horse turning before the sound finished echoing. The shot hit the canyon wall behind where he'd been a half-second before. He had his rifle out as the horse came around. 2 men on the left rim. He could see them now exposed by their own muzzle flash. He fired once, forcing them down behind the rocks. Ride, he shouted at Eleanor. She didn't ride. Instead, she pulled her horse hard against the right canyon wall and had the 10-gauge leveled at the right rim before Elias fully registered the movement. 2 men had appeared there. The shotgun blast sent them scrambling back. One of them dropped his rifle. Then the shooting came from behind them, from the canyon entrance. Elias swung around. 2 riders blocking the back exit. At least 2 more pressing in from the front. They were penned in. He pulled his horse alongside Eleanor's. The 2 animals were pressed against the canyon wall, shifting and nervous in the noise and gunsmoke. He could hear men moving on the rim above, repositioning. He counted the angles. Left rim, 2 men. Right rim, 1 gun down. 1 repositioning. 2 at our back. At least 2 coming from the front. Thaddeus is with them, Eleanor said. Her voice was flat, not shaking. She'd seen him had better eyes than Elias in the shadows, at the back, with McCready. Elias looked. She was right. Thaddeus Vance was on a gray horse at the canyon entrance, holding his rifle at a downward angle. McCready was beside him. McCready's the threat, Elias said. Thaddeus is. He searched for the right word, uncertain. Another shot from the left rim, closer this time. Elias returned fire, moved the horse forward 10 feet. Fired again. Kept moving. Predictable targets die. Moving targets live. That was the first thing. He took them through 40 brutal seconds of it, keeping both horses moving. Firing to suppress rather than to kill. Buying distance toward the far end of the canyon. Eleanor reloaded the shotgun one-handed while riding at a trot, the shells coming from her coat pocket with practiced economy, he registered. Distantly. The burn before he registered the sound. The bullet hit his left shoulder from above the left rim, one of the repositioned men. It went through clean. He could tell that immediately from the quality of the pain, which was sharp and burning rather than the deep structural wrongness of a bone hit. It knocked him forward over the horse's neck. He grabbed the saddle horn, straightened, kept riding. You're hit, Eleanor said. She'd seen it. I know. He pressed his arm against his side, compressing the wound. I'm still moving. Keep going. They were 30 yards from the far end of the canyon now. He could see the open country beyond the exit rolling ground. Brush, the possibility of cover and speed. 20 yards. Behind them, McCready was shouting at his men to move up. The sounds of horses at the canyon entrance. They were going to press forward. Close the gap. 15 yards. He looked back. Thaddeus was at the back of the pack, hanging behind McCready's charge, and in that moment, as Eleanor's horse pulled ahead toward the canyon exit, Thaddeus raised his rifle, swung the barrel toward Elias's back, and held there, clear shot, 30 yards. Thaddeus Vance had grown up hunting. He didn't miss at 30 yards. The shot didn't come. Elias watched Thaddeus hold the rifle raised for 3 full seconds. He could see Eleanor's hair, loose from her braid, flying behind her as she rode. He watched Thaddeus see her. The rifle came down. Elias didn't have time to think about what that meant. He drove his horse out of the canyon and into open country after Eleanor, and they rode hard for the high ground without looking back. They ran for 20 minutes. Elias let Eleanor set the pace, because his shoulder was getting louder about its complaints, and his judgment on speed was compromised. She drove her horse hard and smart, angling up a rocky slope where hoofprints wouldn't hold, cutting through a narrow stand of pine where the canopy was too low for easy pursuit. When she finally pulled up, they were on a granite shelf above the tree line with sight lines back down the mountain in every direction. No pursuit visible. The canyon was a dark thread in the valley below. No riders on the open ground. She turned to look at him. He was still on his horse, which he considered an achievement. His left arm was hanging, and his coat sleeve was dark with blood from shoulder to elbow. How bad, she said. Through and through. No bone. He shifted his weight, and the shoulder reported back sharply. I've had worse. That doesn't reassure me the way you think it does. She was already dismounting, already opening her saddlebag. Get down, get down. Elias. He got down. He had to use the right arm to lower himself from the saddle, and his left side had nothing to offer. He made it without going to his knees, which he counted as a small victory. She had him sitting with his back against the granite in 2 minutes. She cut his sleeve with the small knife she wore at her belt, opened the wound to the light, looked at it closely with the focused attention of someone who dealt with worse than she'd expected. It's clean, she said. You were right. Through and through. But you're bleeding hard. Pressure and wrap, he said. That's all it needs right now. I'm aware of that. She was already doing it, cloth from the kit. Pressure. A firm wrap that made him catch his breath. Her hands moved efficiently. She'd done this before. He wondered about that briefly, and then focused on breathing. When she tied off the wrap, she sat back and looked at him. They were ahead of us, she said. Yes, which means Blackwood has people watching the high routes, not just the main road. He expected us to try this. He's smart. Elias rested his head against the granite. The cold felt good against the back of his neck. He's been doing this for years, and he hasn't been caught. That requires intelligence as well as money. Thaddeus knew the high route, Eleanor said quietly. I used to tell him things, before I understood who he'd become. She said it without self-pity, just an acknowledgement of a fact. Information had moved from her to Thaddeus to Blackwood, and now they were sitting on a granite shelf with a shot-through shoulder because of it. He didn't take the shot, Elias said. Eleanor was quiet. He had me. Clear. He didn't fire. She looked at her hands for a moment. He's not a killer, she said. He's a coward. There's a difference. He'll betray people and take their money and tell himself he had no choice. But pulling a trigger on family, she stopped. Even Thaddeus has a line. The line might move, Elias said. If Blackwood presses him, I know. She looked out at the valley below. We can't trust the original route. Can we find another way to Cheyenne? He thought about the terrain, the distances, his shoulder, and what it would cost over 2 more hard days of riding. There's a way, he said slowly. Takes us up into the high country proper, above the timber line. It's rough, and there's weather coming in from the northwest. He looked at the sky, which had been lying to them all day, clear and bright, while the clouds built behind the peaks. Storm, maybe tonight, maybe morning. Can we outrun it? Probably not. She took that in. Then we find shelter, and we wait it out. There's an old trapper's cabin, he said. Burned the route into my head years ago when I was working this territory. About 6 miles north, below the snow line. Nobody's used it in years, but the walls are stone, and the roof was good last time I saw it. How long ago was that? 4 years. The roof could be gone. It could. He started to push himself up, and she put a hand on his good shoulder. 1 more minute, she said. You lost blood. Give yourself 1 more minute. He stayed. The wind moved over the granite shelf, cold and clean. Below them, the mountains went on for miles, the ridges stacking back one behind the other until they blurred into the pale sky. He was aware of her, sitting close beside him, her shoulder 3 inches from his, her hands still resting loosely in her lap after finishing the bandage. He was also aware of how much that shoulder hurt, which was a useful thing to focus on. "We'll make it to the cabin," he said. "Yes," she said. "We will." She stood and held out her hand. He took it, used it to come upright without aggravating the shoulder. She didn't make it a moment. She just helped him up, practical and steady, and then turned to check the horses. He put on his coat, got back in the saddle, and they rode north into the coming weather. The storm hit before they reached the cabin, not all at once. First, the wind changed direction, swinging from west to north in the space of 20 minutes, picking up speed as it went. Then the temperature dropped fast, the particular fast drop that meant real snow. Not a light dusting, but the heavy, serious kind that the Wyoming high country produced in November, like it was making a point. The first flakes came sideways, driven hard, stinging on the face. Elias had been navigating by landmarks he barely remembered from 4 years ago. The stand of white pine at the creek bend, the red rock formation shaped roughly like a hand, the long meadow that ran up to the ridge. He hit all three and came out above a narrow gulch with the cabin at the bottom, stone walls dark against the snow that was now falling in earnest. He pointed, and Eleanor followed him down. The cabin was 20 feet square, stone walls to the eaves, a log roof under about 8 inches of old snow. The door had a wooden bar that had warped in place, and took Elias 2 attempts with his good shoulder to work loose. Inside was dark and cold, and smelled of old wood, and the particular dry must of a space that had been sealed for years. He stood in the doorway and let his eyes adjust. Stone walls solid, dirt floor. Dry, a stone fireplace taking up most of the north wall. Stacked with the trapper's last load of wood, still there 4 years on. A rough wood shelf with 3 tins on it, he'd check those later. 2 wall bunks with rope lattice. No mattresses. A table. 2 stools. Better than he'd hoped. "Get the horses," he said to Eleanor. "I'll get a fire going." She didn't argue about which job to take. She went back out into the snow, and he heard the horses' hooves on the frozen ground as she led them to the lean-to on the cabin's south side. He'd seen it from the path. Barely standing, but enough to cut wind. He got to the fireplace. It took 3 attempts with 1 good arm and frozen fingers, but the trapper's old wood caught on the 3rd try, and the fire took hold. He fed it carefully too much too fast, and you'd crack cold stone. He brought it up slowly, listening to the cabin creak and groan as the heat began to work against the cold that had settled into every surface. Eleanor came back in stamping snow off her boots. She pulled the door shut and wedged it with a piece of split wood she'd found on the lean-to floor. The wind pushed against it, and the wood held. She looked at the fire. Then she looked at him. "Sit down," she said. "I need to." "You need to sit down before you fall down." She took off her coat and hung it on a peg by the door. "You've been riding on will and stubbornness for the last 2 hours. Sit," he sat. She got the tin medical kit out of her saddlebag. She'd brought it inside, he noticed, along with the oilskin package containing the ledger, which she set the shelf above the fireplace where it would stay dry. She set the kit on the table, looked at him, and said, "Coat off. It's going to be cold. The fire's going. Coat off." He worked his right arm out first, then the left, which announced its feelings on the subject loudly. She helped him without being asked, handling the coat carefully around the bandaged shoulder. The wrap she'd done on the mountain had done its job. The bleeding had slowed and mostly stopped. But the cloth was stiff with blood, and the wound needed to be properly cleaned, or he'd be fighting infection within 24 hours. "I need to do this correctly," she said. She was looking at the wound with her head tilted, thinking through the steps. "I have carbolic acid and clean cloth. It's going to hurt. I've been hurt before. I know. I'm telling you anyway. I think people deserve to know what's coming." He looked at her at that. She was already preparing the cloth. Not looking at him, she worked methodically, cleaned the wound front and back. The carbolic acid was specific in its objections, and he held the edge of the table with his right hand and breathed through it. She was fast and precise, and when she probed to ensure the channel was truly clear, she warned him before she did it. He appreciated that more than he could have explained. When she began threading the needle, he said, "You've done this before. My husband had a mishap with a plow blade the second spring we were here. Cut deep on the forearm." She held the needle up to the firelight, threaded it in one motion. "The doctor in Red Rock wanted $40 to ride out. We didn't have $40. So you learned. I bought a medical guide from the traveling merchant, and I read it twice before I touched the wound." She sat beside him, the needle ready. Robert said, "He was more scared of me having a book than of the cut itself." Elias almost laughed. The needle went in, and the laugh died, which was probably appropriate. She closed the wound in 8 stitches, front and back, tied them off clean, wrapped the whole shoulder tightly. "Don't use it," she said. "I may need to. I know you may need to. I'm telling you not to by default." She collected the instruments, cleaned them, packed the kit. "You lost a significant amount of blood. You need water and heat, and you need to stay still." She put a pot of snow on the fire to melt. She found the trapper's tins on the shelf. 2 of them were beans. One was beef tallow, which was not food, but was useful for the cold. She had dried venison and the last of the biscuits in her saddlebag. She made a meal from the combined resources, with the practiced competence of a woman been solving supply problems her entire adult life. Outside, the storm had moved from serious to committed. The wind was a constant voice against the stone walls. Snow hissed against the single small window. The fire threw good heat, and the cabin, small as it was warming toward genuinely comfortable. They ate at the table. Simple food, eaten quietly. The fire popped. The storm pushed at the walls, and the walls held. When they were done, Eleanor refilled the water tin from the second pot of melted snow and set it near him. "Drink all of that," she said. "You're bossy when someone's been shot," he said. "I'm bossy when someone is being careless about blood loss." She sat across the table. "Drink." He drank. The night deepened around them. There was nowhere to go, and nothing to do but wait out the storm. And after the sustained noise and motion of the last 2 days, the stillness had a particular quality to it, like a bell that had been rung and was still resonating. Eleanor got up and checked the horses once, came back cold and wet, stood by the fire for a long time, her hands extended toward the heat. He watched her and said nothing. "Tell me about the Pinkertons," she said, eventually. She was still facing the fire. "What it was really like." "Why?" "Because you left. And you're not the kind of man who does things without reason. And because we're snowed in. And I'd rather know who I'm trusting than spend the night wondering." He thought about where to start. "I was 26 when I hired on," he said. "Thought I was joining something with purpose. They sold it that way, protecting people, enforcing the law, bringing order to places that didn't have any. And some of it was true. The early work, tracking criminals, returning stolen property. That part was real. But the money came from the industrialists, railroads, mines, steel companies. And when your money comes from one direction, eventually your work starts going that direction too." He looked at his hands. There was a strike in Pennsylvania. Iron workers, 1,878. These were men working 16-hour days in conditions that killed people regularly. They wanted a 10-hour day and a wage that kept their families fed. Their request was reasonable by any honest standard. And Pinkerton sent you. Pinkerton sent 40 men. We were told the strikers were dangerous agitators, threatening private property. We were told force was authorized. He paused. Some of those men had worked those furnaces for 20 years. They had families in the company houses, bought food from the company store, owed the company more than they could ever earn back. The strike was their last lever. Eleanor had turned from the fire and was watching him. "We broke it in 2 days," he said. 1 man killed, 11 hospitalized. The union dissolved. Everyone back to work at the original conditions. He was quiet for a moment. "I filed an objection to the use of force. It was noted and dismissed. The supervisor called the dead man an unfortunate casualty of necessary action. And you left." "I left. Eventually. I won't pretend it was immediately." I filed the report, took the dismissal, went back to work. Told myself the next job would be different. He looked at the fire. It took me another 8 months and 2 more strikes before I understood that the next job was never going to be different. Because the problem wasn't the specific work. It was whose interests the work served. Eleanor sat down. She folded her hands on the table. Thought for a moment. Accountability requires consequences, she said. You understand that? Now, that's why you know the difference between that talks about justice and one that actually pursues it. The Pinkertons had no accountability to the people they hurt. Blackwood has no accountability to the families he steals from. The mechanism is the same. The ledger creates accountability, he said. The ledger creates the possibility of accountability, she corrected. The people who use it, the judge, the marshals. Whoever acts on it, they're the accountability. Records are only as powerful as the people willing to act on them. He looked at her, and if Briggs won't act on it, then we find someone who will, she said simply. And then someone else. The truth in that ledger doesn't expire. It doesn't stop being true because the first person we show it to fails us. She was matter-of-fact about it, not defiant, just clear. Robert understood that. He didn't build that ledger for one judge. He built it to be undeniable. Eventually, the undeniable forces a reckoning. He was quiet for a while. The fire had burned down to a steady low heat. The storm outside was a permanent sound now. Folded into the silence of the cabin, the way the breathing of the horses was folded into the silence of a barn. I have to ask you something, he said. She waited. Thaddeus, when this is over, what do you want for him? Eleanor looked at the fire. A long pause. I want him to answer for what he did, she said, to Robert's memory, to those families. To me, I want a real answer, not an excuse. Another pause. But I don't want him dead, if that's what you're asking. He made choices because he was afraid and weak. That deserves consequences. It doesn't deserve a grave. Some men would say weakness that leads to harm is as bad as cruelty that does. Some men are wrong, she said. Cruelty knows what it is and does it anyway. Weakness is a failure of courage. Both deserve to be called what they are, but they're not the same thing. And treating them the same is how you end up with a world that doesn't distinguish between them. He thought about that. You think about things carefully, he said. I've had a lot of time alone to think. She looked at him directly. Bookkeeping teaches you that precision matters. Call a thing its right name and put it in the right column. Everything else falls apart if you don't start there. Robert taught you that. Robert and I taught each other. A softness in her voice now. Not grief exactly. More like the warm weight of something that was gone, but had been real. He was a good man, not a brave one. Particularly, he was afraid most of the time. But he knew what was right, and he worked toward it quietly and consistently. That kind of courage doesn't get poems written about it, but it builds ledgers that outlast the people trying to burn them. Elias thought of Robert Vance's handwriting. Small, careful, consistent column after column for 4 years. He'd be glad you're still fighting for it, he said. Eleanor looked at him for a moment. Yes, she said quietly. I think he would. The fire needed feeding. She got up and added 2 pieces of the trapper's wood, and the flames came back up and filled the cabin with flickering orange light. That night she sat beside him through the worst of his fever. It came on around midnight, the body's argument with what had been done to it. He woke from a light sleep, sweating despite the cold. The shoulder, a constant hard pulse of pain. The kind of heat under the skin that meant the body was working hard to keep ahead of infection. He didn't say anything. He'd had fevers before. You rode them out. Eleanor woke on her own. She'd been dozing on the other bunk, her coat over her for warmth. She came over, checked his forehead with the back of her hand, looked at him. Fever. I know. She got the clean cloth and the water tin and sat beside him. Cool cloth on his forehead, refreshed every few minutes. She didn't talk. She didn't perform concern. She just sat there and did what needed doing. In the quiet, steady way, she did everything. At some point, he stopped tracking time. The fire, the cold cloth, the pain. Eleanor's presence at the edge of his consciousness, it all blurred into a continuous. not unpleasant sensation of being looked after. You don't have to stay, he said at some point. I know, she said, and stayed. He woke properly sometime before dawn. The fever had broken. He was cold and damp and exhausted, but the sharp systemic wrongness was gone. The shoulder hurt cleanly, the way a healing wound hurt, rather than the deeper infected heat of the night. Eleanor was asleep in the chair she'd pulled to beside his bunk, her head leaning against the stone wall, one hand resting in her lap, still holding the folded cloth. The fire was low, but still burning. She'd kept it fed through the night. He lay still and looked at the ceiling. He was 45 years old. He'd been alone for most of it, not because he lacked the capacity for company, but because the life he'd led had burned through relationships the way a fire burned through kindling fast, bright, and leaving nothing behind. There'd been a woman in St. Louis. Years ago, he'd convinced himself that the work came first and that she'd understand. She'd been understanding right up until she wasn't. And then she was gone, and he'd told himself it was better that way. He looked at Eleanor asleep in the chair. She'd sat with him through the night, not because she needed anything from him, not out of obligation, not for any strategic reason, just because it was the right thing to do for a person who was sick. He understood, lying there in the cold dark of the trapper's cabin, that he was in serious trouble. Not from the wound, not from Blackwood's men, from Eleanor Vance. The storm blew itself out overnight. By morning, the world was white and still, and blindingly bright, the way Wyoming could be after a hard snow, every surface clean, the air sharp and precise, the sky a shade of blue that didn't seem like it should be real. Elias was on his feet by full light, his shoulder complaining but functional. Eleanor had inspected the wound and declared the infection beaten. The fever hadn't returned. He was stiff and slower than normal, but operational, which was the only rating that mattered. They spent the morning preparing for the descent. The horses had survived the night in the lean to cold, but fed and watered from the snow. Eleanor had melted in the trapper's pot. She'd done that at some point during the night. Between checking his fever and feeding the fire, he didn't know when she'd slept. He asked her. I slept enough, she said. That's not an answer. It's the answer I have. She was checking the horse's hooves for ice pack, moving efficiently. We need to reach Cheyenne in 4 days. What's the route from here? He looked at the terrain. The snow had changed everything. What had been passable rock yesterday was buried under 18 inches. What had been a dry creek bed was now a potential ice slide. South first, off the granite, down through the pine country, he said. We pick up the Laramie River about 8 miles south of here and follow it east. It's a longer route, but the snow will be shallower at lower elevation, and the river trail is reliable. Blackwood's men, if they have any sense. They went back to Red Rock when the storm hit. This weather would have made the high country impassable for pursuit. He looked at the sky. But we don't assume they gave up. We assume they regrouped. Agreed. She finished with the horses and frowned to look at him directly. How's the shoulder, honestly? Hurts, usable. Use your right arm for anything that requires strength. Left arm for balance only. Understood. Elias. She waited until he looked at her. I need you functional, not heroic. Functional. There's a difference, and the difference matters. He held her eyes for a moment. Understood, he said again, meaning it this time. They rode out into the white world. The descent took most of the morning. Careful work, picking through snow-covered switchbacks, testing footing before committing weight. Elias led. His horse was good on uncertain ground, a calm, experienced animal who'd been through worse, and she took each step deliberately, which set the pace for Eleanor's horse behind. They didn't talk much. The terrain required attention, and the silence was comfortable. The kind that develops between two people who've been through enough together that silence doesn't need filling. They picked up the Laramie River by noon. The trail alongside it was largely blown clear by the channel wind, and the horses moved better on the firmer ground. They made 6 miles in the afternoon before the light started going. He found them a camp in a river bend where a cut bank blocked the north wind, and a stand of willow gave shelter. No fire, they were out of the high country, and back in territory where a campfire could be seen. Cold camp, cold food, the temperature dropping fast with the dark. They sat with their backs against the cut bank, wrapped in their bedrolls, and ate dried venison in the dark. Tell me about the route into Cheyenne, Eleanor said. If Blackwood has men watching the approaches, there are 3 main roads into Cheyenne. He'll have men on all 3 if he's thought ahead. Elias turned it over. But I know someone in Cheyenne, a man named Clifford Stills, runs a livery on the south end. He's straight. He was a deputy U.S. Marshal for 10 years before his leg went bad, and he moved to the livery business. He knows the back approaches to the federal courthouse. Can we trust him? I trusted him with my life twice before. He's never given me a reason to doubt him. That's good enough, she said. We contact Stills first, get the lay of Cheyenne, and approach Briggs through a route Blackwood won't anticipate. That's the plan. It's a good plan. She was quiet a moment. 3 more days. 3 more days, he agreed. The river moved quietly in the dark beside them. Stars above the cut bank. The cold was absolute, but not cruel. They were well out of the high country. And with the windbreak and good bedrolls, it was survivable. He was nearly asleep when Eleanor said quietly, "Thank you." He didn't respond immediately. Thought she might be drifting. "For coming back," she said. "That first morning, you came back." He lay still in the dark and looked at the stars above the cut bank. "You'd have found another way," he said. "Probably," she said, "but I'm glad I didn't have to." The second day on the river trail brought them down out of the high country entirely and into the broad rolling land north of Cheyenne. Flatter here, more exposed, better grass under the snow, and they passed 2 ranches distant. Smoke rising from chimneys without incident. Elias felt better about his shoulder. It was stiff and would be stiff for weeks, but the clean pain of a healing wound was manageable. Eleanor had redressed it that morning, checked the stitches, pronounced it on track. They made good miles. That night, they camped in a shallow draw east of the river. Still cold camp, still no fire, but the terrain had gentled, and the distance behind them was real, and the distance ahead was getting shorter. 1 more day. Elias was taking last watch before dawn when he heard the horse. Single animal, moving slow and deliberately, trying to be quiet, coming from the north. He was on his feet with his rifle before the rider came over the rise above the draw. In the pre-dawn gray, he could see the shape of a man and a horse. The man was riding with his hands out from his sides, visible, clearly meaning not to alarm. Elias called out quietly, "Stop there." The rider stopped. "I'm not armed," a voice said, low, a little ragged. "I came to find you." "Eleanor," a pause, "Eleanor. I need you to hear me." It was Marcus Washington. Eleanor had woken at the first sound of hooves. She was standing behind Elias, her shotgun in hand. He heard her breath change. "Marcus," she said. "I'm alone," Marcus said quickly. He was dismounting now, hands still visible, moving slow. "I rode hard to find you. I need to tell you something before you reach Cheyenne." Elias didn't lower the rifle. "How did you find us? I know this territory." Marcus looked tired, not overnight tired, but days tired. The particular exhaustion of someone who'd been carrying something very heavy. "And I know where you'd come down off the high country if you took the north route and then swung east. Robert Vance used to talk about the Laramie River Trail." He looked at Eleanor. "Please, let me talk to you." A long pause. "Lower the rifle," Eleanor told Elias. He lowered it, kept his right hand on it. Marcus came into the draw. In the growing light, Elias could see the man's face clearly. He looked hollowed out, like something had been taken from him recently, and the space it had occupied wasn't filled yet. 3 days ago, Marcus said, after you left. Blackwood came himself, not McCready. Blackwood. He looked at the ground, then at Eleanor. "He brought my son." Eleanor went very still. "He had August. He'd taken him from the road when August was riding to Laramie with the federal filing." Marcus's voice stayed even with great effort. "He sat across the table from me, and he told me that August would hang for the murder of a deputy in Casper in 1876. He paused. "August has never been to Casper. He was 17 in 1876, and he was here, working this farm, and I know that to be true." But Blackwood has a deputy who will swear otherwise. He has a judge who will convict. He looked at Elias. He said that if I tracked you and led him to you, August would be released and the charge would disappear. If I refused, the deputy would file by end of the week. Silence in the draw. The sky to the east was going from black to dark blue. The first suggestion of dawn. He's here, Elias said. Not a question. His men are. Positioned half a mile north. Marcus's voice cracked slightly on the next words. He has August. He had him when I left. He forced himself to look at Eleanor. I'm sorry. I am deeply, profoundly sorry. I couldn't. His voice failed entirely for a moment. He's my son. Eleanor walked toward Marcus. Elias tensed his hand, tightening on the rifle. Eleanor stopped in front of Marcus Washington, and she looked at him for a long time. Then she reached out and put her hand on his arm. I know, she said. Marcus looked at her. His eyes were wet. How many men? She asked. 6. With McCready. August is where? Blackwood's men have him at the old survey station, 2 miles west. Is he hurt? They hit him when they took him. Marcus stopped. He was standing when I left. He's strong. Okay. Eleanor's voice was calm and deliberate, not cold-warm even, but focused. Here's what we're going to do. She looked at Elias. He looked back. 6 men with McCready, his shoulder compromised, the ledger in her saddlebag, and what appeared to be a very efficient trap closing around them. Tell me you have a thought, she said to him. Working on it, he said. Work faster. She looked back at Marcus. Did you tell them exactly where we were? I told them you were on the Laramie River Trail south of the second bend, Marcus said, which was true 2 days ago. So they know the trail, but not this exact draw. They'll be moving south from the second bend, searching. How long do we have? Marcus did the math. An hour, maybe less. Elias looked at the terrain, the draw, the rise above it, the open ground to the south and east. We can't fight 6 men and keep the ledger safe, he said. One of those things has to be the priority. Eleanor was very still. Then she said something he hadn't expected. The ledger goes with you, she said. You ride for Cheyenne? Now hard. And you? I stay. She held up a hand before he could speak. Marcus stays with me. We go north. We let McCready find us. Eleanor without the ledger. We're just 2 people and a story that can be denied. She was laying it out as clearly as she laid out a balance sheet. McCready takes us to Blackwood. Blackwood doesn't kill us immediately. We're more useful as leverage than as corpses. And he knows it. That buys time. She looked at him with those steady, clear eyes. You get to Cheyenne. You get to Judge Briggs. You show him the ledger, and you get the marshals moving. She paused. Ride hard enough, and you can be back in 2 days. A lot can happen in 2 days, he said. Yes, she held his eyes. But you'll come back. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a request. It was a statement of fact delivered by a woman who had decided to trust him completely and was not going to equivocate about it. He wanted to argue. He ran through the alternatives, rapidly taking 6 armed men with 1 good shoulder, trying to flee with both of them while they tracked his every step, attempting to reach the marshals with Eleanor in the field and no knowledge of her safety. Every alternative was worse. You have to stay alive, he said. That is my strong preference, she said. If McCready, I know what McCready is, she said quietly. I know what Blackwood will and won't do with us while he thinks the ledger might still surface. He needs us functional to negotiate with. He's not stupid enough to hurt us as badly before he knows the ledger is destroyed. And if he thinks the ledger is destroyed already, then you better ride fast, she said. He held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he took the ledger from the saddlebag, checked the oilskin wrapping, added his own outer canvas cover, and secured it. He put it in his saddlebag, buttoned the flap, and tightened the saddle girth. He turned back to Eleanor. She was watching him. He thought about what he wanted to say, and none of it was adequate, and they didn't have the time for it anyway. He reached out with his right hand, and she took it brief. Firm, a grip that said what words would have taken too long to say. 2 days, he said. 2 days, she said. He mounted and rode east into the dawn. And he didn't look back, because if he looked back, he would not have been able to keep riding. So he kept his eyes on the lightening horizon and he rode. And the sound of the horse's hooves on the frozen ground was the only sound in the cold morning. Eleanor watched him go until the gray distance swallowed him. Then she turned to Marcus. He was standing with his head down, ashamed in the posture of a man who'd done something he couldn't undo and was living in the aftermath of it. She looked at him for a moment. Marcus, she waited until he looked up. Poverty and terror make cowards of us all. She said it plainly. Not an excuse of fact. You did what a father does, what any parent does when their child is threatened. No one who hasn't stood in that position has the right to judge you for it. He stared at her. I am not going to punish you for saving your child, she said. When this is done, we will punish the men who forced you to choose. She said the last sentence with a quiet, iron certainty that made it sound less like a wish and more like a promise already half kept. Now, lead me to Macready and do exactly what I tell you. He straightened. Something changed in his face, the collapsed look of guilt replaced by something steadier. What do you want to do? He asked. I want to be seen without the ledger, she said. I want Macready to take us to Blackwood. I want Blackwood to believe he's won. She picked up her saddlebag, empty of the ledger now, and checked that the useless papers she'd substituted in its place were visible if the bag was searched. And then I want to keep us both alive for 2 days. That's all. That's everything, she said. They rode north toward Macready's men in the thin morning light. Eleanor did not let herself think about the gray-blue horizon to the east, or the horse crossing it at a run, or the man in the saddle. She had made her calculation, committed to it, and opened her hands. The rest was trust. She had learned, across a hard life, that some things could not be controlled and some things could. The ledger was in the right hands. August was alive. Elias would reach Cheyenne. She had 2 days. She had survived worse on less. She rode forward into the morning and did not look back. Blackwood's holding room was a converted storage cellar beneath the hotel. Stone walls, a single lamp, a cot with no blanket. The door was heavy oak with an iron bar on the outside. Eleanor had been in worse places. She sat on the cot and thought. That was what she did when everything else was taken from her, she thought, clearly in sequence, one thing at a time. She went through what she knew and what she didn't and what she could still control. What she knew. Elias had the ledger and a 2-day lead. Blackwood believed the ledger was still with her because she'd let Macready search her bag and find the substitute papers, and Blackwood had accepted it furious, initially, tearing through the false documents before going very still in the particular way of a man recalculating. He wasn't certain. She could see that. The uncertainty was buying her time. What she didn't know, whether August Washington was still unharmed, whether Elias had made it to Cheyenne, whether Judge Briggs was in session. What she could still control, very little, but not nothing. Marcus was in a separate room. She'd heard them, put him there 2 doors down. He was alive. She'd made sure to convey to Blackwood, clearly and in front of witnesses, that Marcus had been coerced. She put that on the public record in the only courtroom available to her, which was Blackwood's own hallway. She said it loudly enough that 2 of Macready's deputies heard it, men who would, eventually, have to live with what they'd witnessed. She was planting seeds in bad soil. It was still worth doing. She slept through the first night. It was a deliberate choice. Conserve everything. Rest while she could. Be sharp when sharpness was required. Macready came in the morning. He sat across from her with his hat pushed back and his expression of habitual contempt, and told her that Blackwood was a reasonable man, that if she told him where the real ledger was, she'd be released. She told him she didn't know what he was talking about. He described, in detail, what would happen if she continued to not know things. She looked at him steadily and said, you should start thinking about the difference between following orders and committing crimes. Those are 2 different columns in a ledger, Sheriff, and the law takes that distinction seriously. He left without getting what he came for. She spent the rest of the day thinking through the next step. If Elias made it to Briggs, if Briggs moved, if the marshals came. That was 3 large ifs stacked on top of each other. And Elias had been shot recently and was riding on a healing shoulder in November weather. She needed a backup. The lamp was kept burning through the night. Small mercy or oversight. She wasn't sure which. But it gave her light. And light was something. On the second day, mid-morning, the bar on the door moved. Not McCready. A young deputy named Holt. She'd seen him around town for a year. 19 years old. Recently married to the daughter of the German immigrant Brower. He set a tin plate on the floor and started to back out. "Mr. Holt," she said. He paused. "Your wife is Emma Brower," Eleanor said. "Her father's land claim is in my husband's ledger. He's one of the 12 families Blackwood stole from." Holt's face did something complicated. "I don't know what you're—" "Yes, you do," she said quietly. "You married into a family that lost 40 acres to a fraudulent filing. You know what it cost them. You've heard the story." She looked at him. "I'm not asking you to do anything right now. I'm asking you to think. Think about what side of this you want to be on when it's over." He left. He didn't respond, but he left the lamp oil full. That evening, the bar moved again. She expected McCready. Instead, the door opened, and Thaddeus Vance stepped through it. He looked terrible. He'd looked bad in the canyon during the ambush, but this was worse, hollowed. Unshaven, a man wearing his own guilt, the way some men wore a heavy coat, bent by the weight of it. He stood inside the door and didn't come closer. "Eleanor," he said. She looked at him, said nothing. "I need you to know." He stopped. Started again. "I need to explain. I know why you did it," she said. "Blackwood offered you something. Money, probably, or protection. And you were afraid, and Robert was gone, and you made a choice." She let that sit for a moment. "What I don't know is whether you're still making that choice." He looked at the floor. "McCready is going to do something tomorrow," he said. It came out barely above a whisper. "Blackwood's patience is he stopped. He's not going to wait much longer." Eleanor kept her voice even. "Tell me what you know." "I can't. If they find out I was Thaddeus." She said his name with a firmness that made him look up. "Robert is dead. Those families lost their land. Whatever you're afraid of, it's already here. The only question left is what you do about it." A pause. "He was your brother. Robert was your brother. What do you think he'd ask you to do right now?" Thaddeus stood very still. "There's a back way out," he said finally. "Cellar door at the end of the hall. It comes up in the alley behind the laundry. At night, there's no one watching it." Eleanor stood up. "Not yet," he said quickly. "Not tonight. McCready checks at midnight. But after that, maybe 2 hours, there's a window. Get Marcus out the same way," she said. "Can you do that?" He nodded jerkily. 2 in the morning. "Be sure." He nodded again and left. She sat back down on the cot. She thought about what Thaddeus had risked by coming to her. Not enough to balance the scales. She was clear-eyed about that. But a step in a real direction. And real steps mattered. You didn't rebuild trust in one night. But you started somewhere. And where you started was with one real choice. At 2 in the morning. The bar moved silently. She came out into the cold alley behind the laundry, with Marcus beside her. Thaddeus at the rear, holding his breath with every step. The alley was dark and empty, and the cold hit her like a wall after 2 days in the lamp-heated cellar. She stood for 5 seconds, orienting. Then she turned to Marcus. "Can you ride?" "Yes." She looked at Thaddeus. He was standing against the wall, half in shadow, looking at her with an expression she didn't have time to anatomize. She would reckon with it later, when there was time. "Thank you," she said simply, and meant it. Then she turned and walked toward the edge of town. She had no horse and no ledger and no weapon, and 2 days had nearly passed. What she had was a town full of people who had been living under Blackwood's thumb for years, and a name and a face they knew, and the truth of what had been done to their neighbors. It was enough. It was going to have to be. She started knocking on doors. The first door was Brower's. He was in town. She knew, because Emma Brower's confinement was close, and August had mentioned the family had come in to be near the doctor. Brower opened the door in his nightshirt and looked at her, standing in the cold alley in the dark, with 2 days of cellar on her face. He opened the door wider. "Come in," he said. "I can't stay," she said, "but I need you to listen, and then I need you to talk to your neighbors." She told him the truth, plain and direct, what the ledger contained, what Blackwood had done, what was coming if the marshals made it in time, and what needed to happen in town before they arrived. Brower listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in his careful English, "What do you need us to do?" She told him. She went door to door through the cold dark, and she knocked, and she told the truth. The Pettigrews, the Hendersons, whose son had lost a mining claim 2 years ago. Old Caleb Moore, who ran the feed store and had been overcharged by Blackwood's bank since 1873. The widow, Sato, whose husband's farm on the East Ridge had disappeared into a territorial land associates filing the previous spring. She didn't ask anyone to fight. She asked them to stand. "Show up tomorrow," she said, at each door, in the square. "When Blackwood brings out his prisoner, just show up. Show your face. Let him see he doesn't own you." Some doors she knocked on twice before they opened. Some people said no. She thanked them and moved on. Judgment had no place in this night. Most said yes. By 4 in the morning, she was at Marcus's sister's house at the edge of town. Ruth Washington answered the door, 12 years old, and she took one look at Eleanor and pulled her inside without hesitation. Eleanor sat at the table and drank hot coffee and looked at the girl across from her. "Your father's safe," she said. "He'll find his way here." Ruth nodded. She was sitting straight, watching Eleanor with that serious, focused attention she brought to everything. "Is it going to work?" Ruth asked, directly the way she did everything. Eleanor thought about the honest answer. "We've done what we can do," she said. "We documented the truth. We told it to people. We're going to stand up in front of it tomorrow." She looked at the girl. "That's all anyone can do. The rest depends on whether the people and the systems we trust actually work. And if they don't, then we document that too," Eleanor said. "And we keep going." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to stand in the square tomorrow," Ruth said. "I know you are," Eleanor said. They brought Elias into the town square at 10 in the morning. He was on his feet, which he counted as a victory, though a modest one. His hands were tied in front of him. His shoulder had been reacquainted at some point during the night with the end of a rifle stock, and it was reporting its feelings about that experience in sustained and detailed terms. McCready walked beside him, 2 deputies behind. The square was already set up a gallows, which told Elias that the timeline had moved faster than Eleanor had calculated. He looked for her in the crowd. There was a crowd. That was the first surprise. Blackwood clearly expected spectators, but not this many. 24 people at least, standing in the cold, not with the loose posture of men who'd wandered by, but with the deliberate stillness of people who'd come with purpose. Elias looked for Eleanor and didn't find her. He looked for Marcus, also absent. He noted the faces he could see Brower, whom he recognized from the supper at the Washingtons' table. A woman he didn't know, standing very straight. Old man in a feed store apron. He noted all of this and filed it away, and focused on the immediate problem, which was the gallows in the center of the square. Blackwood was there, dressed well. As always, the theater of authority made visible in a good coat and a gold watch chain. Judge Pruitt stood beside him, a weasel-faced man in his 50s who had the expression of someone doing arithmetic and not liking the total. Blackwood looked at Elias with something close to satisfaction. "Mr. Thorne," he said, "bounty hunter, former Pinkerton. No family of record in Wyoming territory." He spread his hands slightly. "Nobody's going to miss you." "Probably not," Elias agreed. McCready shoved him forward toward the gallows steps. Then Eleanor walked out of the alley on the south side of the square. She walked the way she always walked, like she had somewhere to be, and the ground under her feet was hers. She crossed the square and stopped in the open space between the crowd and the gallows. And she looked at Blackwood. The mayor's expression shifted. McCready's hand went to his gun, Mrs. Vance. Blackwood's voice stayed smooth. "You've been busy." "I have," she said. "You have something that belongs to me." She reached into her coat, pulled out the green cloth ledger. Elias went still. McCready went still. Blackwood held out his hand, satisfaction spreading across his face like water, across a flat stone. Eleanor walked forward and placed the ledger in his hands. He opened it, scanned the first page, turned to the middle. His eyes moved quickly, checking. Then he closed it. He walked to the burning barrel at the edge of the square, kept burning all winter for the deputies, warming their hands on cold days, and dropped the ledger into it. The crowd watched it burn. Blackwood turned back to Eleanor with the expression of a man who had just solved his last problem. "It's over," he said. Eleanor looked at him. She smiled. It was a small smile, and it was cold, and it did not reach her eyes. And Blackwood saw it, and the satisfaction on his face developed a crack. "That ledger," Eleanor said, clearly, and at a volume the crowd could hear, "is a copy I made 3 weeks ago. The original left this territory 2 days ago." She looked at him steadily. "Marcus Washington has been riding for 3 days. He's carrying the real ledger to a federal circuit judge right now." She paused. "I've been here, with you, since yesterday, which means you've been watching the wrong person." The square was very quiet. Blackwood stared at her. "You're lying," he said. "Check your back trail," she said. "Ask yourself where Marcus Washington has been since the day your men burned his barn. Ask yourself why a man whose son you threatened would ride to find me in the high country, a 2-day ride in November, instead of simply going straight to Cheyenne." She watched him run the math. "He needed me to believe he'd betrayed us," she said. "He needed you to believe it too. That required a convincing performance. Marcus Washington is a man who has been performing under pressure his entire life." She held Blackwood's eyes. He was very convincing. Blackwood turned to McCready. "Ryder, now, Cheyenne Road, it's too late," Eleanor said. "He's been gone 3 days. The marshals are already moving." That was not strictly confirmed. She said it with the certainty of someone who had made her calculations and was prepared to live by them. McCready drew his gun. He pointed it at Elias. "Then we finish this now," McCready said. His voice had gone flat in the way of a man who'd run out of other options and had arrived at the only thing he knew. "Judge, rule the prisoner guilty, right now." Pruitt went white. "Bull, I can't without proper right now," McCready repeated. And then the alleys moved. From the south alley, Brower stepped out with a rifle. From the north side, the widow Sato. From the east, Holt, the young deputy. Emma Brower's husband stepped away from the gallows structure and turned to face his own colleagues. From the feed store doorway, old Caleb Moore with a shotgun that had seen 40 years of hard use and looked completely capable of seeing 40 more. The Washingtons came last. August, freed sometime in the night, one eye still swollen, walking beside his father from the west side of the square. Ruth behind them, Naomi, Clara, small and serious, standing next to her mother. 24 people, standing in the cold. Not an army, just neighbors. Just the people whose land and labor and dignity had been taken by the man in the good coat, finally deciding they'd stood behind their own doors long enough. McCready looked around the square. His gun was still on Elias. "Bull." Blackwood's voice had changed. The performance was gone. What was underneath was smaller and older and genuinely afraid. Bull put it down. McCready didn't move. "Think," Blackwood said. "Think about what you're doing. If you shoot him now, in front of all these people." "These people don't matter," McCready said. "We matter," Eleanor said. She said it the way she said everything else, simply, directly, like a line in a ledger that needed to be acknowledged before you could move forward. "We have always mattered. You just had enough power that you could pretend otherwise." McCready swung the gun toward her, and then hoofbeats, not one horse, dozens, coming from the Cheyenne Road in a hard, sustained rhythm that meant organized men moving at speed with official purpose. The U.S. Marshals came into the square like weather, 6 riders in a line, badges catching the winter light. The lead marshal already calling out his authority before he'd fully pulled his horse to a stop. McCready turned toward the sound. The split second of his distraction was all it took. Elias moved shoulder or no shoulder, stepped forward and drove his elbow into the side of McCready's gun arm. The shot went wide, into the cold sky. Then, Marcus Washington's large hand closed around McCready's wrist from the other side, and the gun came down, and that was the end of it. McCready hit the ground. Blackwood stood in the square, with his gold watch chain glinting and his good coat and nowhere to go. The lead marshal, a gray-haired, weathered man named Aldrich, who had the economy of movement of someone who'd been doing this a very long time, walked his horse to a stop 10 feet from Blackwood and looked at him. "Josiah Blackwood," Aldrich said, "I have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of fraudulent land claim filings, conspiracy, and obstruction of federal land records." He looked around the square with the calm professional assessment of a man adding details to a report he was already writing in his head. "Is there going to be trouble?" Blackwood looked at the marshals. He looked at the townspeople. He looked at Eleanor. He straightened his coat. He put his hands out. "No trouble," he said. Thaddeus, standing at the edge of the square, where he'd been since Eleanor had come out of the alley, lowered himself to his knees without being asked, his hands raised. Pruitt was found attempting to exit via the courthouse back door and was collected by a deputy marshal before he'd gotten 10 feet. It was over in less than 4 minutes. The federal proceedings took 3 months. Elias gave testimony in Cheyenne in late November, his shoulders still in a partial sling. Eleanor gave testimony twice, once before a federal grand jury and once at the full trial. She brought Robert's ledger, the original, and walked Judge Samuel Briggs through every column in careful, precise language that left no ambiguity anywhere. Briggs was, as Elias had said, a man who paid attention to evidence. He asked good questions. He took notes in his own hand. He excused no one and required every name in the ledger to be accounted for. Blackwood was convicted on 11 counts of federal fraud. Sentence, 15 years at the federal penitentiary in Illinois. Judge Pruitt was disbarred and convicted on 3 counts. He moved his family to Kansas before the sentence was delivered, which didn't help him. The Territorial Land Commissioner, the governor's man whose signatures appeared in the ledger, resigned before charges were filed. The resignation was accepted. There was discussion, long and loud, about whether resignation should have been enough. It probably wasn't. It was what happened, which is sometimes a different thing from what should happen. And Eleanor said so clearly in the newspaper interview the Cheyenne Daily Leader ran in December. She said it because it was true, and because true things, put clearly on the public record, have a longer life than silence. McCready was convicted of assault, corruption, and conspiracy, 20 years. Thaddeus Vance pleaded guilty to conspiracy and received a reduced sentence in exchange for full cooperation and testimony, 3 years, with possibility of early release. Eleanor did not advocate for leniency. She also did not advocate for additional punishment. She told the prosecutor exactly what Thaddeus had done, including opening the cellar door, and let the record speak. She visited him once before sentencing. She stood across the table from him in the jail, and she looked at him. "I'm not going to tell you it's forgiven," she said. "That's not honest, but I'm also not carrying it." She was quiet for a moment. "When you're out, if you want to build something honest from what's left, you'll have to do that yourself. Nobody can give you that." He nodded. He looked like a man who understood he was getting less than he deserved and more than he'd earned. "Thank you," he said, "for what you said about Marcus." "That was true," she said simply. "I don't need thanks for saying what's true." She left. The land was restored across the first week of December. 12 families, all of them. Federal marshals oversaw the refiling at the land office with a federal recorder brought in from Cheyenne specifically to ensure nothing was altered or lost. Marcus Washington was the first man to sign the corrected deed to his 40 acres. August stood beside him when he signed. His black eye had healed. He'd ridden 4 hard days to Cheyenne in November snow, carrying the real ledger in an oilskin under his coat. And he'd arrived at the federal land office looking like exactly what he was, a young man who'd done something important and knew it. Judge Briggs had looked at August Washington across his desk and asked him to describe the chain of custody of the document he was carrying. August had described it precisely, in clear language, without embellishment. Briggs had looked at him a moment longer than necessary. "How old are you?" "Son, 19, August said. "Have you considered the law?" Briggs said. August looked at him steadily. I've considered that the law doesn't always work for people like me. Briggs was quiet. No, he said. It doesn't. That's a true statement, and an important one. He picked up the ledger. Which is why we need people like you making sure it does. August went home and thought about it for 3 months. In the spring, he accepted a clerkship with a federal advocate in Cheyenne who was looking for someone who knew the territory and could read a land record. Ruth Washington, for her part, showed up at Eleanor's door in February with a blank ledger she'd bought, with the coins she'd saved, and a request to begin the bookkeeping lessons Eleanor had promised. Eleanor began them the same afternoon. Elias left in mid-November. Shortly after testifying, he told Eleanor he had business to settle. She knew what the business was: the bail jumper in Laramie, 2 months overdue, and the general settling of accounts that a life like his accumulated. She didn't ask him to stay. She didn't ask him anything. He saddled his horse in her yard on a cold, clear morning. She stood on the porch with her coffee and watched him without performing anything. She'd gotten very good over the years at not performing. He tied his saddlebag and tightened the girth and then stood by his horse for a moment. I don't have good language for this, he said. I know, she said. What he stopped. In that cabin. What happened there? I know what happened there, she said. He looked at her. I'm going to come back. I know that too, she said. He stood by the horse another moment. Then he nodded, once, mounted, and rode south. She watched him go. She went inside and finished her coffee and opened her accounts book and started the day's work. She had 12 families' restored land records to organize and file, Ruth Washington's first bookkeeping lesson to prepare, and a ranch that needed a new fence line before the real cold set in. She was not waiting. She was living. They were different things. He came back in March. The snow was still on the high peaks, but the lower country had started to green at the edges. The first thin suggestion of spring, working its way up from the creek bottoms. He came up the road to her ranch on the same roan horse, older and tireder, both of them. She was in the kitchen garden when she heard the hooves. She looked up. He pulled the horse to a stop at her gate and looked at her over the fence. He'd shaved recently, which was notable. He was wearing a shirt she hadn't seen before. He had no rifle slung from the saddle. He had a bedroll, a saddlebag, a set of tools she could see the handles of, and nothing that looked like the working gear of a bounty hunter. She set down her hand fork. You're back, she said. I told you I would be. You did. She walked to the gate. Did you settle your accounts? All of them. He got down from the horse. He looked at her directly with those gray eyes that had, she'd noticed a long time ago, the quality of being completely honest. He didn't know how to be anything else when he looked at her. I turned in my badge. The bounty license. All of it. He paused. I'm done with that work. She looked at him, at the tools in the saddlebag, at the absence of a rifle. The fence line on the north pasture needs replacing, she said. Before summer. It's a 2-week job, maybe 3. He looked at the pasture, looked at the fence, made the same practical assessment she'd already made. I can do that, he said. There's a room in the barn, she said. It's dry and it has a stove. She paused. For now, he agreed. The edges of his eyes moved slightly in what, on another man's face, might have been called a smile. She opened the gate. He led his horse through, and she walked beside him across the yard toward the barn. And the spring light lay flat and gold on everything, on the fence posts and the kitchen garden and the thin green coming up at the edges of the fields. And above it all, the Wyoming sky went on for what felt like forever. Months later, Elias was in rolled-up shirt sleeves, driving a new fence post into the north pasture ground. The post mallet came down clean and even, and the post went straight. Eleanor came out of the house with 2 cups of coffee. She walked across the yard and handed him one. He took it with his right hand. The shoulder had healed well, the stiffness mostly gone. He drank and looked out at the fence line, straight and solid, stretching away across the pasture toward the ridge. She leaned against his shoulder, not dramatically, just rested her head there, against the worn fabric of his shirt. The way you rested against something you decided to trust. He put his arm around her. His hand rested on her shoulder, easy and settled. They stood in the quiet and drank their coffee. Below the ridge, the land went on, wide and hard and indifferent and beautiful. The kind of country that broke things and also, sometimes, in the right circumstances, with the right people choosing to stay and fight and remain, built them back up into something stronger than what had been there before. The fence was solid. The records were straight. The land belonged to the people who had earned it. And under the Wyoming sky, in the thin gold light of a hard-won afternoon, two people stood on their own ground and breathed and were, finally, at rest. When the storm finally passed over the high country, it did not feel like an ending. It felt like the land itself had taken a long breath after holding tension for too long, and somewhere between the ashes of a burned barn and the ink still drying on a federal complaint, a truth began to settle into the bones of those who lived through it. That truth was simple, but it was never small. Eleanor Vance did not win her fight because she was the strongest person in the valley. She won because she refused to be alone, because in a world where power depended on isolation, on keeping families separated, fearful and silent, she made a different choice. She documented everything. She wrote it down when others would have buried it. She kept the ledger alive when it would have been easier to burn it and forget. And in doing so, she turned private suffering into public evidence. That is what tyrants fear most, not rebellion, not weapons, but records, because a record is memory that refuses to die. Elias Thorne understood this better than most. He had spent years working for systems that called themselves lawful while quietly serving the powerful. He had seen how easily order becomes a mask for control, and how quickly men convince themselves that obedience is justice. But something changed when he stood in Eleanor's world, not because she preached to him, not because she demanded belief, but because she lived it. She did not speak about fairness as an idea. She practiced it as discipline, even when her home burned, even when fear came in the form of boots on her floor, even when the system told her she had no right to resist. She resisted anyway, not loudly, not recklessly, but precisely, like bookkeeping. Every truth placed in its correct column, every injustice recorded where it could not be erased. And that is where the real lesson of this story lives. Justice in the West was never just about lawmen or judges. It was about who controlled the narrative of truth. Blackwood controlled land, not only by force, but by paperwork, by rewriting ownership on paper while people still stood on the land, by making disappearance legal. That is why the ledger mattered, because it restored what corruption always tries to destroy. Continuity, it said. This happened, this family existed, this land was taken, and it cannot be quietly rewritten anymore. The fire that destroyed Marcus Washington S. Barn was meant to end resistance, but instead, it revealed something stronger than property. It revealed solidarity. Neighbors came, children helped, strangers stayed. And in that moment, isolation broke. And once isolation breaks, control begins to fail. That is something Blackwood never understood. You can burn a building. You can intimidate a man. You can buy a sheriff, a judge, even a town. But you cannot fully destroy people once they realize they are not alone. And that realization is what changed everything for Elias. He did not return to the fight because he suddenly became a hero. He returned because, for the first time in years, he saw a reason that could not be reduced to money, orders, or survival. He saw truth that had weight. He saw a woman who refused to stop standing, even when the world demanded she kneel. And that kind of courage is contagious. Not dramatic courage, not the kind written into songs, but the quiet kind, the kind that wakes up early, feeds horses, stitches wounds by firelight, and still chooses to ride toward danger, because the alternative is accepting a lie. That is the Western truth this story leaves behind. The frontier was never just land. It was a test of what people would tolerate before they decided to speak. Some failed that test. Some enforced it. And some, like Eleanor Vance, rewrote it entirely. She proved that survival alone is not victory. Survival without truth is just delay, but survival with truth documented, shared. Protected becomes something else entirely. It becomes justice in motion. And even though the road to Cheyenne was still long, and the storm of Blackwood's influence still hung over the territory, something irreversible had already happened. The ledger had left the house. The story had left isolation. And truth had started moving faster than fear. That is why this story does not end in the canyon. It does not end in fire. It does not end in blood. It ends in movement. Two riders on a cold morning road, carrying paper that weighs more than gold. Because sometimes, in the Old West, the most dangerous thing you can carry is not a gun. It is proof. And once proof begins to travel, no system built on lies can ever feel completely safe again. That is the legacy of Eleanor Vance. That is the turning point of Elias Thorne. And that is the quiet, enduring lesson left behind in the ashes of Blackwood Mountain. A single truth, written clearly enough, can outlast every man who tried to bury it. All elements within this narrative are fictional and crafted for storytelling purposes. The author bears no intention of referencing real people, cultures, or events in a literal sense. Readers are encouraged to engage with the work as a piece of creative expression rather than documented reality.